what makes a good D&D one-shot? On the surface, it sounds like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? Good D&D is good D&D. Just look through a book, find a fun little segment that you like the look of, run it with your party, couple of hours, no commitments, no follow-up, job's a good one. Except it's not quite that simple, is it? Because I would say that running a D&D one-shot is one of, if not the hardest things that you can do as a DM. Why? Well, part of the reason is because of the name. It's a one-shot. You have just one session to get all of the way through a story from beginning to end. One session to give your party an adventure, throw in a few challenging fights, a few puzzles, a few traps, and a satisfying conclusion. There's no follow-up. If you run out of time, if you prep too much, or heaven forbid, if you run out of stuff, too bad. That's all you've got. So the pressure is on as a DM to plan your time even better, even more carefully than you would in a regular campaign session where you've got a little bit more latitude to just kind of make things up as you go. But this leads into a second issue, which is as a result of all of this careful time management on the part of the DM, one-shots tend to be a lot more railroady than a normal campaign. Oh, what's that party? You want to go and spend half the session chatting to some random NPC? You want to take a boat and check out that interesting island over there? You want to take part in a drinking contest with the dwarves at the bar? Well, sorry, you don't have time for that. We're on the clock here. The DM's got an adventure prepped and we've only got one 4-hour session to get through it all. Difficulty is an issue too. Obviously, you want to make the session challenging for the players, but at the same time, you can't kill them. I mean, this isn't a campaign. They can't just roll up another character. If you kill the party, the one-shot's over. So that makes balancing a one-shot really kind of hard, especially considering the next point, which is probably the hardest one of all to deal with, to wit, the party itself. Because whereas in a full campaign, people usually kind of take their time building up an interesting character, making a cool backstory, making sure it kind of fits into the world that you're creating. In a one-shot, there's no continuity, there's no world building, and so people tend to, in my experience, use the opportunity of a one-shot to experiment, shall we say. Try out something new, maybe some build that they've never tried before, or a silly character idea, maybe some crazy old cat lady warlock who fires eldritch blasts by yeeting cats at her enemies, or what about an artificer who's clearly just Willy Wonka in disguise and all of his spells are themed around types of chocolate, or what about an old man who is both deaf and blind because the player character wanted to try making something challenging for themselves. Maybe a strength-based wizard or an intelligence-based barbarian. You know, one-shots are free real estate for just testing out the craziest ideas that player characters come up with. But not only does this lead to some very interesting character dynamics at the table, it's also far more likely as a result that the party composition you end up with is, frankly, very unbalanced, given that you, as the DM, probably had less time to kind of prep this than a full campaign. You had less time to sense check with the party if what they're coming up with makes sense, and less time to push back on some of their crazier ideas. And this further adds to the issue of challenge and difficulty and keeping things on track that I mentioned earlier. Case in point, the very first one-shot that I ever ran. In fact, it was the very first time I ever DM'd. You can find a full breakdown of that particular one-shot up here in case you're interested. But I ran a one-shot for 3 players. And in my play group, we tend to only ever do one-shots if we've got several people missing from our normal group. And so, the party was on the small side, just 3 players at the table, but that was fine. They were all very experienced people. So one of the players, he decided that he wanted to play a Kenku. And this was before Monsters of the Multiverse retconned the class, and so he couldn't speak Common. and he was very keen to play it straight, that he could only speak by repeating things that he heard. Then we had another player character who decided to play a grung, a character which again cannot speak common and can only speak grung, a language that almost no one ever takes as a backup language. And finally, the final person in the party was a human wizard who, thank God, actually could speak common. The end result being that he was the only member of the party that could actually communicate with any of the NPCs that I had created, and considering the fact that this particular one-shot was designed to be a complex social situation with a central mystery that needed to be solved, that kind of made things a bit of a problem. So with all of these things taken together, you might well ask yourself, well, why on earth would someone actually want to run a one-shot? Well, fortunately, there are a couple of reasons why one-shots are good. For me, a one-shot is a palate cleanser. They are a way of giving the group something different from the usual game that they might play, something for them to sink their teeth into for a few hours. New characters, new party dynamics, new player races and classes. Is the main campaign that you're running a sandbox simulator? Well, great, give them a one-shot that involves a lot of combat, or a dungeon crawl, or a central mystery to solve. Is your main campaign set in a jungle space? Well then, give them one set in the desert, or at sea, or in space. Now obviously you don't have the time to dive deeply into any of these concepts or game types, you've only got a few hours to play with, but I always approach these things by treating them like a small sampling of the different game types that D&D has to offer, an amuse-bouche, if you will. You know, I've taken part in a one-shot that was 100% PvP combat, in which the DM just threw us into an arena and made us spend the entire session just attacking each other. And it worked surprisingly well. On the other extreme, I've had one-shot which was 100% a mystery set on a ship travelling the astral sea. Someone or something was poisoning the ship in hopes of stealing a valuable gem to give to Githyanki pirates. Who could it be? It's definitely someone on the ship. Can the party find the culprit in time to stop the ship from crashing? So for me, that's where the fun of a one-shot lies. You just pick an idea, some strong core central idea, maybe a setting, maybe a type of gameplay, maybe a situation, and then you just run with it. In terms of structure, actually making the structure of your session, I found that most one-shots that I've really enjoyed participating in, and that have stuck with me for a long time afterwards, they kind of follow the same 3-act structure that you might be familiar with from something like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. For those of you who don't know, the hero's journey is another word for the monomyth. Joseph Campbell, who was a scholar by trade, he looked at all of the oral storytelling traditions from across time and from across cultures, from all different parts of the world, even parts of the world where people had never spoken to each other before. And he found a fundamental theme that seemed to run through all of them, that no matter where these stories were coming from, no matter what time period they were being told in, the stories boiled down to a very similar structure to them, a kind of fundamental rhythm that they went to. Now that's not to say that all stories ever written have followed this pattern, but essentially this hero's journey is to storytelling what the 4/4 time signature is to music. As soon as you hear it, you understand it. As soon as it just feels comfortable to you, like slipping on a pair of shoes. And that is the key to success, to making a good one-shot, because it is something that the party are gonna understand. Just a shorthand, a way of getting them like, I get what's going on now. You don't need to explain. So here's how it goes in a nutshell. The hero's journey basically breaks a story down into 2 main phases. We have the ordinary world phase and we have the special phase. The ordinary world is another word for the starting point. It's where the hero begins the adventure and the place to which they eventually return. probably changed as a result of their experiences. The special world, on the other side, is the unusual circumstances that the hero finds themselves in, which underpins the bulk of the story itself. Following this structure, we can therefore see that most stories start in the ordinary world. The hero is just an ordinary guy, nothing special, but then he receives a call to adventure. Perhaps, at first, he rejects the call. He can't be dealing with this right now. He has other more important things to do, but eventually he is forced, through circumstances beyond his control, to take up the mantle and fight. Along the way, he very often will meet some wise old mentor who will then help him to understand the destiny that is calling to him, and from this person, he then learns more of the abilities and skills that he's going to need in order to take down the villains. At this point, the hero fully enters into the special world, and in doing so, we enter the second act of a 3-act structure. We meet friends and allies. The hero starts to face challenges and tests which he has to overcome, but which ultimately aren't particularly perilous or difficult. And all of these things ladder up towards the innermost cave, which is a fancy way of saying basically the place where the MacGuffin or the big bad is hiding. And this is then the hero's toughest challenge yet. He has to use all of the knowledge that he's gained so far, all of the challenges to take on the threats that lie within the cave. But eventually, after going through some climactic ordeal, which often involves the loss of something very important to the hero, he managed to escape with the thing that he set out to get, and is now armed and primed with the knowledge and the abilities to take on the big bad once and for all. At which point the story then enters the third act and the denouement of the story. Translated into D&D speech, this would mean 3 acts, 3 sections, the call to adventure, the tests allies and enemies section, and the ordeal, followed by the reward at the end. You may notice, however, that there is one section of the hero's journey here that we haven't mentioned yet. The road back, the resurrection, the return with the elixir. I'll come on to this a little bit later. But for now, we have these 3 basic sections that we can work with: setup, challenge, and climax. So let's take that beginning part first, the call to adventure. This is the part of the adventure where the party is formed, where it gets together. The party meets each other, often in a tavern or some other place. They are given the mission. This is the part where you, as the DM, can kind of establish what is the ordinary world in which the heroes live. And generally speaking, I like to allocate about 30 minutes to an hour on this part of the session. Now, this might seem like quite a long time, because, let's face it, this section could be done in as little as 1 sentence. Yeah, the party meets in a tavern, and you see on the notice board that there is a dragon attacking the fields nearby, and you decide to help. But I do like to give the party a little bit longer here to kind of settle down and find their feet. Remember what I said earlier, people like to experiment in one-shots. They come to the table with these weird and wacky characters and builds, and so just kind of giving them a little bit of time at the beginning to just settle down, discover who they are, what the dynamic at the table is, and just give them a chance to kind of use these characters in a safe environment before you kick off is normally advised. So, for example, I had a one-shot that I made once where the session actually started in a jail. Everyone was in prison. They had none of their equipment. It was completely dark, and they had no idea why they were in prison. None of them could remember being arrested. And so the opening section, the opening hour here, was really just spent giving the party complete free rein to find a way to work together to escape from prison. And I, as the DM, had absolutely no idea how they were supposed to do this, but they managed to do it, you know? They had complete free rein, they worked together, they figured it out. They used abilities and skills that were quite unusual, and in the process they kind of met each other. And upon escaping from prison, they then went to the guard room where the guards were posted, obviously took them down quite easily by working together, and there they discovered the arrest warrant that had led to them being arrested in the first place. And they saw that they were all on the hook for apparently committing the same crime, some heinous murder. A crime which, of course, none of them could remember committing, and as far as they were concerned, they were innocent of it, and therefore we now have the hook. Not only has the party had a chance to meet each other, not only has the party had the chance to kind of use their abilities and just in a safe environment, but they have a clear hook for the story going forwards, namely find a way to clear their name and find the real culprit of the crime. And it was a fun session for everyone as a result. Alright, so now we're into the middle part of the session, and this really is the meat and potatoes, you know. This is going to be the longest part of the session. You're aiming for at least a couple of hours here. This is the bit where the one-shot actually happens. Maybe it's a mini dungeon crawl, maybe it's a sequence of combats, maybe there's a mystery that needs solving. Whatever it is that you've set the one-shot up as being, it happens here. Now that's not a lot of time, 2 hours, so you can't overly stuff this section, and in my experience this is the part where if a one-shot does fall down, it falls down here, because DMs can often over-prep. I'm guilty of this myself, and it leads to this part becoming a bit bloated, and then you end up not having enough time to do a satisfactory climax, and the whole session kind of ends in a bit of disappointment. So balance is needed in this part, a little bit of flexibility. It needs to be challenging, yes, but not deadly. And as the DM, I'm always kind of ready to step in more than I normally would to throw the party a bone or two and help them out if they're struggling. One way or another, they are getting through this to where they need to be. If that involves fudging rolls, moving rooms around, skipping combats altogether, whatever, I'm there for it. This is a one-shot. You don't have time to be a fair DM. You are completely biased on the party's side. But then finally, all of this builds towards the climax, the ordeal. And, you know, given the sort of game that D&D is, it's a tabletop role-playing game, that means we're going to be having some sort of boss fight, probably. There is a big bad, you need to take him down. And in my experience, you do need the time here to make this section epic. And that means you're probably going to be wanting to spend about an hour minimum on this part. Yes, 1 hour of combat. Followed, of course, by a very quick wrap-up at the end, because, let's be honest now, you do need some sort of conclusion, but you're never going to come back to these characters or this world ever again, so the wrap-up really can just be done in a couple of sentences. Oh, you go back to town and you give everyone the gold. Hooray, the end, you go off to do further adventures. That's not the important part, but in order for the players to walk away feeling accomplished and that they've achieved something, you do need to make the final encounter feel substantial and epic. The players at my table, we don't dilly-dally, we're all quite experienced with the game, and we tend to have our turns prepped before it comes round to us in the initiative order. But even if you've got 4 players at the table, plus the DM, if each person there takes 2 minutes on their turn, which is very possible, and your boss requires 5 turns to kill because he has a lot of HP, which is also very possible, well, that right there is a minimum of 50 minutes needed. Fights take time. So if you give the party all of that, which I've just gone through, you would have a successful one-shot on your hands. I've certainly played through more than a handful of one-shots that felt exactly like that. It's the sort of adventure that you would get if you ever played Adventurers League. Very straightforward, very simple, one and done, jobs are good. But the title of this video is not what makes a successful one-shot. It's what makes a good one-shot. What makes a one-shot that sticks in your mind for days afterwards? What makes a one-shot that you, as a DM, aim to replicate when it's your turn to sit behind the screen? And for this is where we introduce that 4th segment of the hero's journey that we previously skipped. Think about some of the great stories that you've ever read or some of the movies that you've watched. Think about how often the hero in the story doesn't actually succeed the first time they try to take down the villain. There's usually a moment near the end of the second act where the heroes actually fail in their quest at the first time of asking, or they realise that they've maybe been barking up the wrong tree the whole time and the real villain is this other person over here. There's this moment that happens where the hero is at his lowest ebb. Everything is hanging on the line and it looks as though the villain is going to get away with it. But then, character growth. The hero maybe makes some discovery, or they find a new well of strength within themselves, or perhaps they are revitalized by the power of friendship. Whatever it is, they are now supercharged with this knowledge and the experience of their earlier failure to now take down the big bad once and for all. They throw themselves at the enemy, and finally they succeed. Now obviously a D&D session is not a novel or a movie, and you don't have time to be forcing character growth and development on a party, nor should you ever interfere with people's characters in that way. So you might say, well, that's impossible to do. But what you can introduce as a DM is a twist. One of the best one-shots that I ever had the pleasure of playing through was set at a concert. Basically, the heroes had been hired on as security for this very famous musician who had had some death threats made against him. And so we, as the party, are protecting this establishment. We're walking around looking for any suspicious individuals. And of course, there's a couple of red herrings, but then suddenly these hooded figures attack in the middle of the night. And of course, the party leaps in to take them down because that's what they were hired to do. But it turns out that this was just a distraction, because actually the musician himself was in service to the dark gods and was using his concert, a heavy metal concert of course, to summon demons from the 9 hells. Those hooded figures that the party took down, oh, well, those were actually paladins and priests who were trying to stop the ceremony going through. And so the party is then forced to take down these dark gods for themselves, interrupt the summoning ceremony, and capture the musician before he can do any more damage. It's still a 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end, but thanks to that twist in the middle, it sticks in the mind for a long time afterwards. So armed with all of this knowledge, let's try putting this into practice, right? So in the very next video to this one, I'm actually going to follow my own advice here, and I'm going to create a one-shot for you in real time in front of your eyes. I honestly have no idea how this is going to go. I'll be up front. I'm going to use AI to do a lot of the early idea generation, things like ChatGPT and otherwise, but then I will be stepping in to kind of streamline things and improve things so that they kind of make sense and follow a clear 3-act structure and would actually work within a single 4-hour session. But hopefully in this way you'll be able to see how I personally approach making a good one-shot, the choices that I make, and you can then adapt this when you're making your own one-shots and to fit your own style and to fit your group. So until then, please don't forget to comment down below with your own one-shot ideas, your own experiences. What's made a good one-shot for you? Tell me something that you've been through, your own little war stories. And don't forget while you're doing that to like, subscribe, all that yummy YouTube goodness. But most importantly of all, please have a wonderful day, because you deserve it. And so do I. Bye.